Chapter 12. We must have been walking for days, I do not really remember, when suddenly two men put us at gunpoint and motioned with their guns for us to come closer. We walked in between two rows of men carrying machine guns, AK-47s, G3s, and RPGs. Their faces were dark, as if they had bathed them in charcoal, and they stared intensely at us with their extremely red eyes. When we got to the back of the line, there were four men lying on the ground, their uniforms soaked with blood. One of them lay on his stomach, and his eyes were wide open and still. His insides were spilling onto the ground. I turned away, and my eyes caught the smashed head of another man. Something inside his brain was still pulsating, and he was breathing. I felt nauseated. Everything began to spin around me. One of the soldiers was looking at me, chewing something and smiling. He took a drink from his water bottle and threw the remaining water at my face. "You'll get used to it. Everybody does eventually," he said. Gunshots erupted nearby, and the soldiers began to move, taking the six of us with them. We came upon a river where the soldiers' aluminum boats with motors gently floated. We saw bodies of 11 and 13-year-old boys in army shirts piled by the river. We turned our faces away. The gunshots were getting louder. As we climbed into the boats, an RPG flew from the bushes, exploding on the shore. The top of the river was boiling. A man in army trousers came running down the path towards the boats, shooting at the soldiers. One of the men in my boat opened fire, dropping the man to the ground. The boats headed downstream, and we were let off near a tributary. A soldier led us to Yele, a village that was occupied by the military. It was a big village with more than 10 houses. The soldiers occupied most of them. They had cut down the bush around the village, except for the entrance from the river through which we had arrived. This way, the soldiers explained to us, it'd be difficult for an enemy to attack. In the beginning, it seemed that we had found, finally, safety at Yele. The village was always full of lively chattering and laughter. The adults, civilians and soldiers, spoke about the weather, planting seasons, hunting, and nothing about the war. At first, we couldn't understand why people behaved this way, but gradually, the smiles on people's faces assured us that there was nothing to worry about anymore. All that darkened the mood of the village was the sight of orphan children. There were over 30 boys between the ages of 7 and 16. I was one of them. Apart from this, there were no indications that our childhood was threatened, much less that we would be robbed of it. We stayed in a big unfinished cement brick house along with the other boys. A large green tarp served as its roof, and we slept on the cement floor on tiny blankets that two people shared. The soldiers set up their garrison in another unfinished brick house where they socialized separate from the civilians. In the evenings, they watched movies, played music, laughed, and smoked marijuana. The smell of it covered the entire village. During the day, they mingled with the civilians, and we helped in the kitchen. Kanye and I fetched water and washed dishes. The rest of our friends helped chopping eggplants, onions, meat, and the like in the kitchen. I liked busying myself with work all day, going back and forth to the river, and continuously washing dishes. It was the only way I could distract myself from the thoughts that were giving me severe headaches. But by midday, all the daily chores were done. The evening meal was prepared and only awaited consumption. Everyone sat on the verandas of the houses facing the village square. Parents picked their children's hair, girls played singing and clapping games, and some of the young soldiers played soccer with the boys. Their jubilation and clapping could be heard far down the river. Life was not lived in fear during the day in this village. The soccer games reminded me of the league matches I used to play in when my family first moved to the mining town of Mobemweo. In particular, I remembered a final match that my team, which consisted of Junior and some friends, won. Both my parents were at the game, and at the end, my mother applauded and smiled widely, her face glowing with pride. My father walked up to me and rubbed my head before he held my right hand and raised it up, as he declared me his champion. He did the same to Junior. My mother brought us a cup of water, and we drank, as she fanned us with her headcloth. The excitement caused my heart to pound faster, and I was sweating profusely. I could taste the salty sweat that ran from my forehead to my lips. Standing there with my family, I felt light, as if I was getting ready to fly. I wanted to hold the moment longer, not only to celebrate our victory, but because the smile on my parents' faces that evening made me so happy that I felt every nerve in my body had awoken and swayed to the gentlest wind that sailed within me. I distanced myself from the games in the village and sat behind houses, staring into the open space until my migraines temporarily subsided. I didn't tell anyone what was happening to me. My symptoms weren't mentioned in the morning when the sergeant doctor, as the civilians called him, lined up children and families for treatment. The sergeant doctor called for fever, cold, and many other illnesses, but he never asked if anyone was having nightmares or migraines. At night, Alhaji, Juma, Mariba, and Kane played marbles on the cement floor under the moonlight that made its way through the open window panes. Musa had grown popular with the boys and would always end the night with a different story. I quietly sat in the corner of the room, clenching my teeth, as I didn't want to show my friends the pain I felt from my headache. In my mind's eye, I would see sparks of flame, flashes of scenes that I had witnessed, and the agonizing voices of children and women would come alive in my head. I cried quietly as my head beat like the clapper of a bell. Sometimes after the migraine had stopped, I was able to fall asleep briefly, only to be woken by nightmares. One night I dreamt that I was shot in the head. I was lying in my blood as people hurriedly walked past me. A dog came by and began to lick my blood ferociously. The dog bared its teeth as my blood sweetened its mouth. I wanted to scare it away, but I was unable to move. I woke up before it started what I was afraid it was going to do to me. I was sweating and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. One morning, the atmosphere in the village suddenly became tense. It wasn't clear what had caused the change, but something was about to happen. All the soldiers assembled at the village square, dressed in their uniforms, carrying their weapons and ammunition in backpacks and waist belts. Their bayonets hung by the sides of their army trousers as they stood still, with their helmets under their arms. Attention, at ease, attention, at ease. I heard the voice of the drill instructor as I walked to the river with Al-Haji to fetch water. When we returned, the drill instructor had stopped warming up the soldiers. Instead, Lieutenant Javadi stood in front of his men, his hands crossed behind his back. He addressed them for hours before they were released for lunch. While the lieutenant was talking to his men, we quietly went about our daily chores and at the same time tried to eavesdrop on what he was saying. But in order to hear him, we would have to get closer and join the line of soldiers, which was out of the question. We walked about all day quietly speculating about what the lieutenant could have told his men. In the evening, the soldiers cleaned their guns, sometimes firing a couple of rounds into the air. These random gunshots sent the younger children diving between the legs of their parents. The soldiers smoked cigarettes and marijuana. Some sat alone, while others gambled and joked with one another into the night. Some watched a movie in one of the big tents. Lieutenant Chabadi sat on the veranda of his house and read a book.